When the Mahdi's warriors reached the palace walls, Gordon left the roof. Alone in his quarters, he put on his dress uniform and prepared to meet his fate. Accounts differ as to what happened next.
By that time, the Mahdists had already killed the guards and swarmed into the gardens of the palace and were rushing towards him. Apparently he arrived at the top of the steps just as the Mahdist spearmen and swordsmen arrived at the bottom, and they just confronted each other. It's quite an amazing sight that they'd finally seen Gordon, the man they'd probably heard so much about, the devil. There is the famous picture, drawn presumably from accounts or simple fantasy, that the spearman rushed up the steps and sank a spear into Gordon's chest, and he fell forward into the crowd and they cut him to pieces.
This is the icon which British artists quickly reproduced and became, as you like, the first Christian imperial martyr. The men who actually saw him die 40 years later told the British officers in the Sudan that he'd in fact died firing his revolver in a corridor in a skirmish. But it's much better, if you like, almost cinematographic, to have him standing there, noble, upright, champion of England, meeting his fate.
Later that day, Gordon's head was shown to one of his officers who had been taken captive. Then it was fixed in the fork of a tree, where small boys pelted it with stones and camel dung. The Queen held Gladstone personally responsible. She wrote to her private secretary,
Mr. Gladstone and the government have Gordon's innocent, noble, heroic blood on their consciences. No one who reflects on how he was sent out and refused help can deny it.
She fired off a furious telegram to the Prime Minister, who was on his way by train to London. Victoria's cables to her ministers were invariably sent in code, but not this one. This one could have been read by anyone on the telegraph line, and it was intended as a public rebuke to the man who had failed her empire and its greatest hero. The telegram was presented to Gladstone by a country station master.
These news from Khartoum are frightful. To think that all this might have been prevented and many precious lives saved by earlier action is too fearful.
Gladstone, unswayed by public or royal hysteria, ordered the British Army to quit the Sudan. But Gladstone had misjudged the mood of the people and of Parliament. The death of Gordon fatally weakened his government. At the next election, he was voted out of office.
It was an immensely damaging incident to Gladstone. Gladstone totally failed to appreciate that somebody to him who appeared a rather insubordinate and crude and untrustworthy junior general would appear to the bulk of the British opinion, and indeed to the Queen, going back to that, as being a real hero of the imperial age.
Gladstone's fall from power was to have serious repercussions throughout the empire, particularly in southern Africa. The absence of his moral influence cleared the way for a man who would lead Victoria's empire down a far more perilous path. Cecil John Rhodes had arrived in South Africa at the age of 17 to work on his brother's cotton farm. There was nothing to distinguish Rhodes from thousands of other British emigrants who left the mother country to seek their fortune in the British colonies. But this young clergyman's son would devote most of his life to expanding British rule and making himself the most dangerous man in Queen Victoria's empire. At first, his ambitions were limited to being a successful farmer. He got along well with his African workers, shared their food and hospitality, and respected their values.
Rhodes had an intuitive feeling for the people of Africa. He was fascinated in African society. He would spend whole nights in kraals. He wanted to understand how they operate. He was quick to learn Zulu so he could communicate directly. He also understood the value that Africans placed on a person's trust. And he was much mocked by the other cotton farmers because he used to pay his labor in advance. And that was seen by the people who worked for him as a sign of trust, and of course it built up their loyalty.
But Rhodes was soon lured away from farming. His arrival in Africa had coincided with a fateful discovery 500 miles away, on a remote farmstead known as Colesberg Kopje. A Dutch settler noticed his neighbor's children playing klip-klip, or 5 stones. His eye was caught by a stone that shone with a particular brightness, and he went to take a closer look. An earlier British visitor had written of this desolate interior,
Her Majesty possesses not in all her empire another strip of land so unlovely.
but as the world would soon discover, it contained riches beyond the dreams of avarice. The stone that the settler had spotted would be called the Eureka Stone, and it led to the richest source of diamonds ever found. Rhodes dropped everything, packed his bags, and joined the diamond rush. The farm at Colesberg Kopje soon became the boomtown of Kimberley. Roughnecks from the gold fields of California and Australia rubbed shoulders with veterans from the American Civil War, English aristocrats and immigrants from the ghettos of Europe, all drawn to a hole in the ground, which was growing bigger every day. To these men, Kimberley promised instant riches, but at a price.
Kimberley was an indescribable place. The noise, the dust, the heat. If you can imagine this settlement of 40,000 people in the middle of nowhere, you could see the dust from the diggings from 10, 15 miles away. And as you came nearer, you entered this awful place. Huts built out of old packing cases, littered with dead animals, the carcasses of dead animals. Flies, infestations of flies.
The Wild West was tame compared to Kimberley. Here there was a bar for every 16 men, and shootings were an everyday occurrence. But Rhodes thrived as a diamond digger. Within a year, he wrote to his mother that he was earning around £100 a week, enough to make him one of the richest young men in England. But in 1872, just a few days after his 19th birthday, Rhodes suffered a heart attack. His doctors told him the attack was mild, but Rhodes knew that from then on, he was engaged in a race with death. He chose a curious form of convalescence, an epic trek across the African veldt. Some believe that during this journey, Rhodes developed his great love and his great plan for Africa.
A lot of commentators have said that those 9 months that Rhodes spent touring Africa by ox wagon, going right up into Boer territory, had an incredible effect on him. Rhodes would be continually hearing stories about the African interior from wandering hunters. Now, I believe that it was on that journey that he formed his first nascent ideas of an Africa that was there, ready to be reached, ready to be taken.
His health restored, Rhodes returned to the diamond fields. Most of the diggers thought that the diamond mine was exhausted and wanted to sell their claims. Rhodes took a gamble and bought them. His hunch was right. Beneath the first seam of diamonds was another, even richer. Rhodes put all the claims under the control of one company, De Beers. Within 10 years, it would own 90% of the world's diamond production. Rhodes would use his wealth to finance his dreams.
Money is power, and what can one accomplish without power?
Cecil Rhodes was half a visionary and half a scoundrel. He was an extraordinarily greedy man. It's recorded that once on an expedition in southern Africa, he was sleeping alongside a British officer and there was one blanket between them. And throughout the night, Rhodes always managed to get the whole blanket, leading his colleague to remain cold. Rhodes always wanted to get his hands on other people's property.
Rhodes dreamed of creating a vast British colony across the length of Africa. To achieve this, he planned to build a railroad from Cape Town to Cairo. But first he needed to win political support in South Africa. He was elected to the Cape Parliament, where he courted the Afrikaner Bond, the party of the Dutch farmers or Boers who were consolidating their own power by taking it from the native Africans.
We're talking at a stage when black people in the Cape voted, provided they fulfilled certain property requirements. They sat on juries where they sat in judgment over white people. This was abhorrent to the Afrikaner Bond. And what Rhodes did was to form a very, very close alliance with them.
Rhodes, who had once prided himself on his lack of prejudice, made a speech in the new Cape Parliament.
Does this House think that it is right that men in a state of pure barbarism should have the vote? Treat the natives as a subject people. Be the lords over them. The native is to be treated as a child and denied the franchise.
Following Rhodes' speech, the law was changed. The vote in southern Africa was removed from all but a handful of native Africans.
Rhodes, throughout his career, was continually shifting the pieces on the board. Consider the diamond mines. If you go back to the beginning of that history, black people owned claims. They were competitors with whites. What Rhodes's requirements were was to have a permanent, reliable black labor force who would be kept within compounds, unable to leave at all, inspected every time they came out of the mines, and the need for a controlled labor force drove Rhodes towards racist policies. If you try to make any political sense out of Rhodes's career, it makes absolutely no sense at all. But if you look at it in economic terms, it makes perfect sense. The alliances that he was making was for profit and for business, and there's no argument about it.
What happened next?
By that time, the Mahdists had already killed the guards and swarmed into the gardens of the palace and were rushing towards him. Apparently he arrived at the top of the steps just as the Mahdist spearmen and swordsmen arrived at the bottom, and they just confronted each other. It's quite an amazing sight that they'd finally seen Gordon, the man they'd probably heard so much about, the devil. There is the famous picture, drawn presumably from accounts or simple fantasy, that the spearman rushed up the steps and sank a spear into Gordon's chest, and he fell forward into the crowd and they cut him to pieces.
This is the icon which British artists quickly reproduced and
When the Mahdi's warriors reached the palace walls, Gordon left the roof. Alone in his quarters, he put on his dress uniform and prepared to meet his fate. Accounts differ as to what